Hello class, this is a quick session on organizational ethics, organizational and managerial ethics, and it's just meant to give you an overview of topics that you will discuss and dive into as we go further into the class throughout your readings and the discussion posts and our communications. So what I plan to do today is go through this deck of slides, and as I said, I'll just give you a quick overview of the topic of organizational managerial ethics. So the first thing I'll do is give you quick definitions of organizational and managerial ethics, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to use the terms interchangeably in this class. I'll then talk about what ethics is not. I'll give you, and then I'll follow that up with a brief, quick overview of the perspectives or views on ethics. So organizational ethics, or sometimes it's called business ethics or workplace ethics, but they all tend to refer to a process of promoting moral principles and standards that guide business behavior. So we're really talking about moral issues and of what we believe is right or wrong in a business situation. Managerial ethics looks at the same thing, but it basically boils it down to the individual. So it says it's an individual's responsibility to make business decisions that are legal, honest, moral, and fair. So what we see in these two definitions first is that the organizational or workplace or business ethics looks at it more from an organizational level, so a higher level. But then the managerial ethics basically says, hey, look, at the end of the day, a business is made up of the people within that organization, and therefore, when we look at ethics, we need to keep in mind that it's really more about the manager or more about the people within the organization. So those are the two different views. For our standpoint, for this class, we're really going to just look at it from the standpoint of both of them being interchangeable terms. So we're just going to say managerial or organizational ethics are all the same thing. We're just looking at ethics in a business environment, whether or not we're referring to the person or the organization as a whole. So that's the first thing we see. The second thing we see is that both definitions have this idea of morality or fairness. So we talk about moral and fair in the managerial ethics. We also talk about moral principles and standards in the organizational ethics. So we understand that there's a legal or an honest, and we can pretty much agree on what that can be in a particular situation. But agreeing on what's moral and fair can be a much more difficult task. And so that's what we kind of want to get into. So when we're thinking about our ethics, we need to understand that ethics is really not the same as our feelings or our religion or what is the law or some culturally accepted norms, nor is it the same as science. It's not the same as any one of these things. So let's look at what we mean by that. So based on those definitions of ethics that we gave earlier in the workplace or managerial setting, let's keep in mind that ethics and feelings are not the same thing. So feelings provide some important information for our ethical choices, but it's not the exact same thing. For example, I choose, or my feelings are that I don't want to drink. I don't care for alcoholic beverages, that sort of thing. But my feelings are not that it's wrong or it's unethical if someone chooses to do that. As a matter of fact, when I go out with my friends, they sort of make fun of me because I'm not the one drinking and smoking. So on the flip side, just because someone chooses to drink or not to drink, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's their ethics. It's not exactly the same thing. Again, our feelings provide information that help us in our ethical choices, but they're not the same thing. We kind of make a joke when I go out and the waitress comes and asks me what I want to drink, and everybody else has ordered all these different alcoholic beverages, and I choose to say, give me your hardest Dr. Pepper that you have. And so, so yeah, it's not the same as our feelings. Similarly, ethics is not the same as our religion. Many people are not religious, but their ethics apply to everyone. For example, we talk about in the music industry. Do you choose to download free music? Do you choose to download free movies and watch movies that are streaming over the internet that you haven't paid for. Some would say, no, I can't do it because it's my religious belief that thou shalt not steal. Others say, you know what, I just choose not to do it because I feel like I want to be able to pay the authors or the musicians or the actors for their hard work. And so just because you choose not to download music and you look at it as stealing, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's your religion that's driving it. You may not be a religious person at all, but you choose still not to steal. Ethics is not the same as following the law either. So a good system of law does incorporate many ethical standards, but law can deviate from what is ethical. Sometimes ethics and the law don't necessarily disagree, but they're not the same either. So an example of this, we tend to watch a lot of reality TV nowadays, and so there's all types of shows out there. And so I can't even tell you which show this was that I saw, but basically the scene was a lady was in a bar, and she was just really drinking a whole bunch. And then we see the cameras on her, and they're showing the other patrons in the bar and the bartender. And finally the bartender says, hey, I'm going to have to cut your tab, and I really need your keys because you shouldn't be driving. And so the lady acts like she's going to give the bartender her keys, but she actually had another set in her purse, and she goes outside and she gets in her car and she drives home. Now, everybody's saying, oh, it's a funny show and she was able to pull that off and that sort of thing, but here you have the camera people right there. The bartender did what was perhaps a legal issue for the bartender to take the keys away from the lady, but then we have the cameramen who weren't legally bound to take the keys away, and because it's reality TV and we're supposed to let this stuff go in reality TV, the cameramen allowed her to get behind the wheel and drive. And thinking about it from that standpoint, sure, it's not the law, but maybe ethically they should have stepped in and perhaps done something in that situation since she could have been a danger to other people. We also have the website Ashley Madison out there. It's been in the news for a lot of different things, but it's all about having an affair. That's what the website is about. Is that against the law? Well, actually in some states you could find some rare rules on this, but for the most part this website is out there and you can do it, but it's not necessarily ethically to do it. So ethics and the law aren't necessarily aligned at all times. The next one is ethics is not the same as our culturally accepted norms. What is acceptable in one particular culture or industry, that sort of thing. And my example of this is when we were young, we all used to say to our parents, but mom or but dad, all my friends are going to the party, why can't I go to the party? Or all of my friends have this particular video game, why can't I have this video game? And so we tried to do and use as our argument that this is what everyone else is doing, it's the culturally accepted thing, whether that culture was just our friends or the culture as a whole, and we wanted to do it as well. But mom, I want a tattoo, or I want an earring because everyone else tends to have one. But your argument to me is, well, Professor Williams, I mean, of course we did this as children, but now we are adults. We don't act this way, and we're not as easily influenced by what's going on around us any longer. Well, actually, research tends to think that we are. And there were two fairly famous studies out there that deal with this situation of how we tend to follow the crowd, even as adults. And one of them is called the Milgram study. And instead of me lecturing to you about this Milgram study experiment, or the second one, which is the ASH study, I've sent you links in an email regarding the ASH study and the Milgram study. And so hit pause on this, go watch those two YouTube videos, and then come back and we'll discuss them very briefly here. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to watch both of those videos. And so the key things to keep in mind from these videos is that the Milgram study actually tended to show how we, even as adults, tend to follow someone just because they are in a higher position. So in this Milgram study, the person in the higher position was the person in the white lab coat, the person running the experiment. And so even though we thought that, even though the subjects thought that they were something was maybe wrong with them giving the shock treatment to the person, they continued to do it because the powerful other told them to continue doing it. In the ASH study, it was very similar, except it was a peer or a group of peers that were convincing the person that, yes, even though their eyes said that it was a different line that was the same, they decided to follow the crowd in most situations. And so you say, Professor Williams, come on now. I mean, yes, we're adults, but these aren't business decisions. These really aren't decisions that people would be making in a business world, and so it doesn't affect us in the business world. We have better sense than to do these things in the business world. Well, we don't have to look very far for examples of how these experiments play out in the business world. And so the latest one here, you can go look up some of these headlines or search for the Volkswagen emissions scandal or crisis. Basically, Volkswagen got in trouble because they were cheating the emissions code. And in short, there were a group of people within Volkswagen at one point that decided we don't want to follow the rules, do what is correct, but we still want to be able to be profitable. So let's go out and make a device that's going to produce false emissions when you go run your reports. So think of it like this. When you go every year and you have to get new tags put on your car, you first have to get your car inspected. And so if you're like me and you had a Volkswagen, there was a chance that your report was saying one thing so that your car would pass emissions, but actually your car was emitting a lower or a worse set of emissions, and so or higher or worse set of emissions. So it's sending a false report. And first we say, well, it was just a few people within Volkswagen. But what we've learned from these other experiments and what we've seen come out in the news is that this was much further and much worse than what we think. And even if it was just a few people, some worker there had to have known what was going on and decided not to say something, either because their peers decided not to say something or because they were told not to say something by their boss. So these things are very critical, and it goes back to the point that ethics and culturally accepted norms aren't the same thing, whether that culture is our culture as a whole or the culture within our organization. And finally, ethics is not the same as science. Science and social or natural science can provide important data to help us make better ethical choices, but science alone does not tell us what we ought to do. For example, we all have various opinions about getting cosmetic surgery. Is it perfectly fine to do that, or should we just keep the face that either we say God gave us, or keep the face that we've had all of our lives because we don't want to follow what the world tells us is beautiful? So anyway, we look at this from an ethical perspective and we say just because it's scientifically possible, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily ethical, one way or the other. And then even when we look at something as simple as cloning, is it good for us to clone? Is it ethical for us to do cloning? And how far are we going to be willing to take those types of practices? Okay, so now that we've looked at what ethics is not, and it's not the same as our feelings or our religion or these other things, it's important to understand what do we tend to base our decisions on from an ethical perspective when faced with these dilemmas in the workplace. So let's look at 6 views or perspectives very briefly. Now you will then in your readings go out and find out more information on these overall views. But here's what's going on, and this is just meant to provide you a quick overview of these particular views. The first one is the utilitarian view. So this view basically says that the anticipated outcomes and consequences should be the only consideration when evaluating an ethical dilemma. In other words, what we tend to do, if we tend to take the utilitarian standpoint, when we're faced with an ethical dilemma at work, we tend to say or take the approach that produces the greatest good and does the least harm for all those who are affected. So we're faced with a problem at work, and it's an ethical problem, and we decide to do whatever is best for our customers or our employees or shareholders, the community, or the environment. So whatever can do the greatest good for these and the least harm, that's what we're going to do. When we looked at the submarine captain who had to choose what to do with the injured crewman, a lot of you said we have to kill the one to save the many. That is a utilitarian view to a situation. So we tend to sometimes base our views and our ethical decisions on the utilitarian view. Sometimes others choose the self-interest view. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that we have to understand that that's the decision we're making. So with the self-interest view, it basically says, when in doubt, you do what's best for yourself. So you do what's best for the decision maker or yourself. And so when faced with an ethical decision at work, you intend to say, I'm going to do whatever produces the greatest good for me. The reason I say this isn't necessarily a bad thing is because a lot of us believe that organizations are there to survive. Organizations are meant to survive. So the organization is going to do what's best for itself. That may mean it's going to have to make hard layoffs. It's going to have to reduce the workforce, that sort of thing. And so in any given situation, I need to look out for myself because the organization is looking out for itself as a whole, and that may impact me, so I need to do what's best for me. So again, it may not be necessarily a bad thing in all situations to take a self-interest point of view. It just depends on the situation. The rights view. The rights view basically says that humans have a dignity based on their ability to choose freely what they do with their lives. And so when faced with an ethical dilemma, in this situation you would say you're going to do the thing that protects basic individual human rights. So in the U.S. we have our Constitution that says, we the people of the United States, and it lists all of our rights as an American. And so we tend to say in a business situation, we're going to do whatever protects those rights. A lot of you took this view when it came to the gun discussion, carrying guns on campus, and you said, hey, you know what, it's our right to carry guns, so therefore I'm not going to stand in the way of this particular issue. And since we're doing it as a discussion board, there's no reason to discuss it any further in here, but be sure to go back and read and look at the comments that your classmates are posting. It's a very good discussion that they're having online right now, or in the discussion board. Okay, the next one is the justice view. The justice view basically says that we need to follow the rules. So in any situation, we're going to do whatever the rules or the law tells us to do. So you may be in a business situation, you're not sure what to do. Which one is the lawful thing to do? That's what you're going to do. So my example here is something like buckle up. It's the law. That's why we wear our seatbelt. We don't wear our seatbelt because we believe it's going to help us or keep us safe if there's an accident. We wear our seatbelt because it's the law, and that's the reason we do it. The last two. So this one, I'm sorry, we've got, the last two. So the integrative social contracts approach basically says that decisions should be based on existing norms of behavior, including cultural, community, or industry factors. Therefore, when we are faced with an ethical dilemma at work, we're going to follow whatever the accepted practices are where we are at that time. As an example, there is there's a practice called slotting. I believe it's called slotting. And this is done in grocery stores. And so if you think about when you walk into grocery stores, everything is on shelves. And when you go to the cereal aisle, they put the adult cereals on the higher shelves because that's at the eye level of the adults. And then they put some of the kid cereals on the lower levels because that's at the eye level of the kids. And a lot of us see this from a marketing standpoint. But there's another practice that you don't really know about. As I said, it's called slotting. And basically what happens is when the people that produce these products come to, or the cereal makers come to put the stuff on the shelves, their product on the shelves, they can pay someone at the grocery store to have their product at a particular part on the shelves, on a particular space. And so you can pay a little bit more and you can get your product in your favorable slot. Some people would call that bribes or bribing in other industries. For example, if we're watching a football game and we see that a coach is paying off the refs, that would be called a bribe, and that would be considered ethically wrong to do. You couldn't get away with doing that. On the other hand, the slotting practice is become a standard in this particular industry, and therefore it's not seen as necessarily being a bad thing. So the integrative social contracts view would say, I'm going to follow whatever the accepted practice is in my particular industry or the culture or community that I'm in. And then finally we have the deontological view, and this one basically says that decisions should be based on personal or religious convictions. So it could be our personal convictions, it could be based on our religious or our religion, and therefore whenever we're faced with an ethical decision at work, we're going to do whatever best aligns with our belief system. Back a few years ago, the popular bands that we were wearing on our wristbands were the "What Would Jesus Do" bands. And so we ask ourselves, what would happen in one particular situation? I'm not sure what to do, but what does my religion tell me I should do? And then that's how we're going to make our decision. Okay, thank you for listening in on this brief overview. The slides are going to be posted as well, and I look forward to continuing to read your discussion boards, and I certainly look forward to seeing how you take these and the research you find on these particular topics in your papers.